Hi, my name is Tom Sightler and I'm the Principal Solutions Architect for Veeam. I'm here today to show you how to install and deploy Veeam Backup and Replication version 9 into your production environment. So let's jump right to it. Installing Veeam Backup and Replication version 9 starts by using the Setup Wizard. To start the Setup Wizard, simply mount the ISO and click on Setup. After running Setup, you'll see the Veeam Backup and Replication Setup Wizard. In this screen, you can see the various components that can be installed, as well as links to documentation and training information on the Veeam website. To proceed with the installation of Veeam Backup and Replication version 9, simply click the Install button. This will launch the Install Wizard. The Install Wizard will guide you through the installation of Veeam Backup and Replication version 9. You must accept the license to continue setup. On the next page, it will prompt you for the license file. Browse to your file system and find the license file that has been sent to you. Simply select and choose Next. It is possible to install Veeam without a license file, but it will operate only in free edition mode. For the primary Veeam install, you want to make sure to install all three components: the Veeam Backup and Replication Server, the Catalog Service, and the Veeam Backup and Replication Console, so defaults will do for this screen. Finally, Veeam gives a summary of the default configuration for an install. However, there is also an option to customize much of the setup. In this screen, Veeam lists all of the default configuration. In many cases, you may not need to change anything, and you can simply click the Install button. However, if you need to customize any of these settings, you can check the box to allow you to specify additional settings, and the wizard will continue, allowing you to customize various options. Let's discuss some of those options. In this screen, Veeam lists the service account that will be used for the install. By default, Veeam uses the local system account. However, it is also possible to use any service account that the user has created. Simply by selecting the box and entering the user and password, Veeam will grant log on as a service rights to this particular user. By default, Veeam installs a local instance of Microsoft SQL Express. This is sufficient for the vast majority of installs. However, if you would like to use an external SQL server, or you have a very large environment, for example, more than 500 VMs or more than 50 hosts, you may wish to use an external SQL server for better performance. The options are available on this screen to allow you to select an external SQL server and instance, a database name, as well as additional authentication. By default, Veeam uses the Windows service account from the previous screen for authentication to SQL. However, it is also possible to use SQL Server authentication by entering a username and password in the wizard below. Port configuration generally can remain default unless you have a conflict in your environment. If you do need to change ports, this is the screen where you should do it. Veeam Backup and Replication has multiple data locations that can be configured during setup. The vPower NFS write cache folder is used during instant VM recovery. When a VM is recovered instantly, the backup file is read-only, but the VM itself needs to support writes. The cache folder holds these writes while the VM is running from the backup until it is moved back to production storage. If it is not sized with enough space, you may not be able to run the VM long enough to move it to production storage. By default, the location is the C drive on the Veeam server. However, it is a good idea to choose a location with additional space or perhaps of higher performance if it is available. The guest file system catalog is used for Veeam file indexing. This is primarily used with Veeam Enterprise Manager to allow functions like one-click file level restore. If you have a large number of VMs with a large number of files, you may need a larger catalog directory. Information regarding sizing of the Veeam catalog is available in the Veeam Best Practices Guide. This is the screen where you can select an alternative location for the Veeam catalog. By default, it is stored on C drive. Finally, after customizing the setting, Veeam once again provides a summary of the settings before the install actually takes place. If you are happy with the settings, simply click Install. So once the install completes, you can simply click Finish to complete the wizard. A restart may be required. After reboot, Veeam Backup and Replication installation is complete. You can access the console by simply clicking on the console icon. New in version 9, the console actually allows for remote connectivity. By default, the local console connects to localhost using the logged-in Windows credentials. However, you can use alternative Windows credentials as well. Simply click Connect to connect to the local instance of Veeam Backup and Replication. After the initial install, when you open the Veeam Backup and Replication console, it will immediately take you to the Manage Server screen. Here you can add your VMware vSphere or Microsoft Hyper-V environments. In this demo, we're going to add VMware vSphere. To add a vSphere environment, simply click on the VMware vSphere link in the GUI. Simply enter the DNS name or IP address of your vCenter. And provide credentials. Veeam will verify the certificate of your vCenter server. If you would like to view the certificate, you can do so at this time to validate that you're connecting to the correct vCenter. Once validated, simply click Connect. Veeam will store this connection for future to validate against man-in-the-middle attacks. After adding your infrastructure, Veeam will return to the menu and you'll be able to configure your proxies and repositories. After the setup, everything is configured as an all-in-one installation. The Veeam server acts as both the main management server as well as a proxy and repository. However, in many cases, this is not what you want for your actual configuration. As you can see, the default repository is configured to C:\backup, which in most cases is not going to be where your actual backups are going to be stored. To actually configure a backup repository, especially if it's on a remote server, we need to add a server to do that. Let's walk through the wizard to configure a repository and see how easy that is. Once you've selected backup repositories, you can simply select the Add Repository button. Here we'll give the repository a name. After providing the repository name, Veeam gives you an option to choose the type of repository that you're going to add. Veeam supports 4 different repository types: Microsoft Windows servers, Linux servers, shared folders such as NAS devices, and deduplicating appliances such as EMC Data Domain and HP Store Once. In this demo, we're going to add a Microsoft Windows server as a repository. Simply select the Microsoft Windows Server option and click Next. Because the server that we are using hasn't been added, I will need to use the Add New button to add a new managed server to the environment. Simply click Add New here and enter the IP address or DNS host name of the Windows machine which hosts the repository. In this case, I'm going to use the IP address to connect to this machine. You can also add a description. Finally, you need Windows credentials. If this was a Linux machine here, you would actually enter Linux credentials. Veeam automatically reaches out to the machine and detects if any previous version of Veeam had been installed. If not, it will automatically install all of the appropriate components. If it finds any previous components, it will automatically upgrade those components. Typically, it takes only a few minutes to add a server as a managed server to Veeam. After the installation is complete, Veeam shows the OS type, core count, and default ports for the installation that is just completed. Click Finish to continue the repository wizard. Now that the server has been added as a managed server, you can select it as one of the repositories. Simply select it from the pull-down and click Next. On the next screen, you can select exactly where to store backups. Simply use the Browse button and find the location on the file server where you would like to store backups. In this case, we've selected the C drive on this server, but in many cases it would be a different drive. By default, Veeam configures a repository with a concurrent task limit of 4. However, in many cases, servers with more drives may be able to support many more tasks. Certainly, 4 is a good place to start. However, feel free to increase this number if you feel you have plenty of drives. For example, recommended settings would normally allow a task count of 1 for every 3 drives in a RAID array. So if you have a large server with 60 drives, you may be able to increase this count significantly. You can also choose not to limit processing count at all. However, this may saturate the repository with I/O. On the next screen, you choose a mount server. The mount server by default for Windows servers is the repository itself. The mount server deserves some attention. It's a new feature in version 9, and it actually allows you to select which server will be used for file level restores. With previous versions, whenever you did a file level restore, the image was actually mounted on the Veeam server itself. In scenarios where there was a remote office, this may not be ideal. For example, if you had a repository at that remote office and you performed a file level restore, the file level mount occurred at the Veeam server that may be located at headquarters. With version 9, you can select the mount server to actually remain at that remote site, thus keeping the traffic local to the remote site and not requiring any traffic across the LAN. This drastically improves performance for file level restores across the network. The vPower NFS service also runs on the mount server. Whenever you perform an instant recovery, the cache directory will be used to store writes for any VM that has been recovered. By default, this is stored in the C drive, similar to the options we configured during setup. However, in this screen, you can pick an alternative location for your cache. In many cases, you may want to create a cache directory in your repository so that it's large enough to store any changes for instant recovered VMs during their recovery process. Simply click Next to complete the wizard. In some cases, a reboot of the remote repository may be required. The wizard will instruct you if this is a necessary step. However, we do not automatically reboot the server. You'll have to do that manually. After the configuration of the initial repository, Veeam Backup and Replication will prompt you to change the location of the configuration backup. By default, Veeam backs up its configuration once a day. But because the initial install only had a repository on the local C drive, that backup is stored on the Veeam server itself. Once you've added a remote repository, it's a really good idea to reconfigure the backup configuration to store on a remote repository somewhere else. So normally the recommendation would be to answer yes to this question. As you can see, you can change the location of the configuration backup at any time using the configuration backup settings available in the options. Because I answered yes to this question, it's already changed the backup to my remote repository. But once again, you can change that anytime in the future. You can also configure how many restore points to keep and provide a password encryption for the configuration backup to protect your saved passwords that have been entered in Veeam for your infrastructure. Once you've added at least one remote repository and changed the configuration backup to point to it, the default repository is no longer required. You can actually simply remove it. And this is probably a good idea to keep people from accidentally selecting it, especially if your C drive happens to be low on space. It's quite easy for someone to pick the wrong repository, run backups, and fill up the hard drive on your backup and replication server. After configuration of repositories, it's time to talk about proxies. By default, the Veeam Backup and Replication itself will act as your only proxy. However, in many environments, you may wish to have additional proxies. Adding a proxy is also a simple task. Simply select the Add Proxy button and choose the VMware or Hyper-V proxy option. Because we've added VMware vSphere in this case, we're going to add a VMware proxy. After selecting the platform, that will start the new VMware proxy wizard. To add a proxy, simply select one of the already added managed servers from the drop-down. You can also use the Add New button to add additional managed servers. In most cases, you'll want to accept defaults for all of the options. Veeam will automatically detect the number of cores in the server and set the maximum concurrent task appropriately. It is recommended to leave these at default. Simply click Next to continue through the wizard. Traffic rules allow you to define encryption and throttling rules, but those won't be covered in this particular session. Simply click Next and the proxy has been added. This system can now be used to pull backup data from your vSphere environment and send it to your repositories. At this time, you may want to remove the original proxy. The Veeam Backup and Replication server, while it can be used as a proxy, it may be ideal in larger environments to actually have it dedicated to management tasks. To remove the proxy, simply right-click and remove. Now your remote server will be used both as a proxy and repository, while the Veeam server will be dedicated to simply managing the backup process itself. After installing and configuring Veeam Backup and Replication, it's time to install Backup Enterprise Manager. Veeam Backup Enterprise Manager is a web interface that allows you to perform day-to-day operations on your Veeam Backup and Replication installation. Installing it is very simple. Simply click the Install button from the Setup wizard. Once again, select the license agreement and choose your license file, just like the original Backup and Replication setup. The default options are correct for most installs. Enterprise Manager also includes a Cloud Connect portal for service providers, which can be optionally installed. However, it is not configured by default. After installing the prerequisites and verifying they all pass, you can click Next. Just like the Backup and Replication setup, the Enterprise Manager setup shows the default configuration. If you're happy with the defaults, you can simply click Install. However, the Enterprise Manager setup offers many of the same configuration options to customize. Let's take a look at just a few of those. Once again, we can customize the service account. By default, the system uses local system. Also, you can use remote SQL or, by default, the local SQL Express instance that was installed with the original BNR setup. And finally, you can customize ports. These are the ports used to access the Veeam Backup and Replication service, as well as the REST API and other services built on top of it. You can also select a custom certificate for SSL. By default, Veeam will generate a new self-signed certificate. However, if your company uses a certificate issued from a certificate authority, you can choose to select it here, and Veeam will leverage that certificate for its web services. After checking the customized settings, simply click Install to complete the install of Backup Enterprise Manager. Once the install is complete, simply click Finish to complete the wizard. The Veeam Backup and Replication Setup wizard also includes the option to install Veeam Backup and Replication Console remote. This allows you to install the Veeam Backup and Replication Console on any Windows server in your environment. This is a new feature in version 9 and is very useful for remote administration. After Veeam Backup Enterprise Manager has been installed, simply click on the icon to open the web interface and complete the configuration. On initial login to the Backup Enterprise Manager, you'll see the dashboard. However, you will need to go and add your backup server to the configuration. Simply click on the Configuration tab. Under Backup Servers, click Add, and add your local Veeam Backup server. It's also possible to install Enterprise Manager on a separate machine, but in this case, because they're both installed on the same machine, we're going to choose localhost. You can verify the collection is working by clicking on Sessions and checking the status of each individual session. As you can see, catalog replication has already completed and database replication for this backup server is currently in progress. Additional information about the session can be seen by clicking on the log. From here you can see the progress of the collections session. Once collection has complete, your configuration of Backup Enterprise Manager is also finished. You should be able to see the vCenter servers that have been added, and you can go back to the main dashboard and you'll be able to see that the backup server has been added successfully. Because we have not configured any jobs or other information, most of the panels in this screen will be empty. However, at this point, Backup Enterprise Manager is configured for use, and any jobs added in the backup and replication GUI would automatically appear in the Enterprise Manager. This completes the configuration of Backup Enterprise Manager. Now that you have learned how to install and deploy Veeam Backup and Replication version 9, be sure to visit veeam.com for more information on all of the great features. Thanks for watching.